The UK is among the most nature-depleted countries in the world, and since the 1970s, studies suggest we've lost between 60 and 70% of our wildlife. But there is good news. The area of Britain's gardens is larger than that of all of our national parks combined, over 10 million acres. Changing our countryside, farms and cities may be an ongoing, difficult battle, but one thing we can all do is change the space that we own, our gardens. So this is my call to action. Watch on for the 5 top tips that you can do today to improve the biodiversity of your garden. So the first tip is this: fencing, or rather the lack of it. Instead of putting fencing in, why not consider putting hedges in instead? They create an amazing habitat for wildlife. They're a food source as well if you put the right sort of thing in. Crucially as well, rather than a fence where animals such as frogs or toads or hedgehogs, one of our fastest declining species, can't get through and can't travel between garden to garden extending their range, they can get through hedges. So it just means that all this wildlife can travel around as it should be able to in the wild. When you're putting in hedges, you can use things such as a box like this, which is probably what you see most commonly, but you could get really creative and imaginative with it and put in some native species that are, like I say, not only a habitat, but also have some amazing berries, nuts, food sources for them. Think about native trees and plants such as these. And what you can even do is grow climbers and creepers through these, such as honeysuckle or ivy, which are both fantastic for wildlife as well. And before long, you'll be seeing things like robins, like dunnocks, thrushes, loads of different types of finch nesting in those hedges, and it'll just be an amazing thing. Wildlife will be coming back to your garden before you know it. It's also worth noting that if for whatever reason you can't put hedges in, or you don't want to, then you should still do this to your garden fences to, like I just said, allow mammals, amphibians, all sorts of creatures that pass from garden to garden to at least have some sort of path through. Tip number 2, leaves and lawns. So your leaf pile might not quite look as large as this one by the end of the year, but have you ever considered not raking it off the soil? It creates mulch over the winter as it rots down and earthworms pull it down into the soil, vastly improving soil health. It also creates a wonderful habitat, a bit like your hedgerows, for invertebrates which lay their eggs in there. They use it for shelter, they hibernate in it over winter. So save yourself a job, don't rake up your leaves, leave them there over winter, and your wildlife in your garden will benefit from it. So lawns as well. There's this very Victorian idea that our lawns have to be perfectly manicured spaces which you can roll out and you could play tennis on. Well, that doesn't have to be the case, and if you don't do that, don't mow the entirety of your lawn, but you could just not mow a part of it. Turn it back to nature, and before you know, you'll have a wonderful meadow-like habitat in your garden. The other thing is it won't just be grass that will grow there. Of its own volition, all other sorts of species will. There will be seeds locked up inside that soil that will have just been lying dormant, or when they have been growing, they've just been snipped off immediately before they can become plants. And you could, if you're lucky, even get things like orchids growing up in it. And again, it provides an amazing source of food for invertebrates and shelter for them as well. My third tip is dead wood. No, not the TV series, this kind. In the wild, it would fall naturally and be left and then be colonised by loads of different types of invertebrates, which are the building blocks of our ecosystems. And not only that, as you can see here, you'll get all sorts of mosses and lichens on there as well. So leave some in the corner of your garden, make a nice pile of it, and loads of different things will use it as a home.
know you all around. If there's anything left in this town, if I said the things you want me to, might lead to someone else but you.
So tip number 4, plants for food. There are a few key considerations to be made. The first one really is where you can, plant native. There's a reason that these plants survive so well in this country, and it's because they've been developing for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And not only that, the wildlife that you're trying to attract to your garden has been evolving with them. So they've got completely used to using them as habitat, to using them as food. So native plants and trees are the best way to go. The other thing is think about all the different wildlife that's coming to your garden. So put out food for birds, plant things out for bees, for butterflies. If you construct a really complex and interesting biodiverse garden, then everything will benefit, especially if you've created lots of food for insects. Well, there are loads of things in your garden, such as birds, such as toads and frogs, such as bats, hedgehogs, that will feed on the invertebrates that you've created an ideal climate for. Ivy is fantastic for wildlife, a great habitat, but also those little blackberries that come out in the winter, a variety of different birds love those, and honeysuckle as well. Honeysuckle is an absolute magnet for pollinators, and it'll look really attractive going through your hedge. 2 other little rules of thumb are that single flowers tend to be best, especially for bees, purely for the fact that they can access them easier than a double flower, and they also tend to have more nectar in them. And the second rule of thumb is that purple plants tend to be more attractive to them as well. Things like lavender, like foxgloves. And on the topic of foxgloves, there are certain types of bee, certain species of bee that specifically feed on those tubular shaped flowers. The other sort of thing that you can be putting in is herbs. I mean, the great thing about herbs, of course, is that you can be enjoying them yourself, and also you can leave them out there for your wildlife in your garden too. So things like rosemary are really appreciated by insects in your garden, as are really traditional English herbs like borage, the flowers of which you can put on your salads, but are also a great magnet for pollinators too. And then of course there's trees to consider as well. So tree-wise, a lot of this will depend on the size that you have in your garden. It would be lovely if we could all have a series of oak trees and beech trees throwing out their nuts and seeds throughout the year. Unfortunately, most of us don't have that space. So if you can do that, go for it. That would be an incredible thing for wildlife. But if you've got a smaller amount of space, you could put something in like a silver birch. A variety of different creatures love silver birch. Moths especially are attracted to it. You could put in something like a hawthorn. Hawthorns are really, really good. They're little red berries, again, a great source of food for birds and a habitat for nesting as well. Holly as well is fantastic. You can let that grow as tall or as small as you like, and again, beautiful red berries, and it's great as a nest site as well. There are a number of other trees that are fantastic for wildlife too. Again, I'll put a little note here. The important thing is try and use native species and try and use a really nice mix of things for a variety of different creatures. Don't just focus on bees, don't just focus on birds. Plant a range of species of different heights, different styles for different types of wildlife. And my final tip, tip 5, is this. Put a pond in your garden. It is the single most powerful thing you can do for the biodiversity of your garden. Not many of us will have the space to put in something like this, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to do a video on a tiny pond that you can put in, literally in a washing up bowl, and we're going to do a time-lapse video almost to see, without putting anything in there, what sort of species colonise it. So why are ponds so good for biodiversity? Well, they provide an important bathing and water source for birds. For insects, they are incredible. So they will provide places for insects to breed, to lay their eggs, to feed, and the same for amphibians as well. Within the first year or so, if you're lucky, you might get things like frogs, like newts, like toads in there, even in quite small bodies of water. So there are a few rules when we're looking at ponds. The first I learned the hard way, use good quality butane rubber lining or similar. I tried to use some cheaper stuff and I got it punctured a couple of times, and believe me, there is nothing more depressing than watching your wildlife pond drain away and desperately trying to save the animals that are in there. So use a good quality butane. Make sure that it is not in too shaded a spot of your garden, but also make sure it's not in too much direct sunlight. It's always good to have a little bit of a shaded area in the pond, which means that certain types of algae won't take over. If you can, make sure that the centre of the pond is sort of 2 feet deep or potentially more. This means that in the winter there's likely to be a pocket of water that will never freeze over in the bottom, which means that any creatures that are living in there can survive. And also make sure that you go out every so often and put a hole in the ice to re-oxygenate the water. The other thing that's important is, I'll put a diagram up here, is to construct it in such a way that there's a shelf for marginals, and I'll put a nice list of marginals that you can put in your pond as well. And also, really, really crucially, make sure that at least one edge of the pond has a gentle slope, so that things like frogs and toads, but also hedgehogs, if they fall in there or they use it for water, that they've got an easy way to get out. You don't want anything drowning in your pond. So there you have it. That was my 5 top tips to benefit wildlife in your garden. Get out there today, implement some of those tips, let me know how they've gone, and in the spring you'd be amazed at the results you're going to end up seeing. If you've found that useful, remember to like and subscribe, and until next video, look after each other. Cheers, bye.